Good.
So, good evening, everybody, or good morning if you're in Europe, good afternoon if you're in Asia. Um, First of all, thank you very much for completing the exam. I've now got the task of grading it, but I'm delighted you all got it done, and hopefully you're still wired deeply with the course materials, and hopefully on a new plateau. And we have we like to practice dynamic capabilities, which means that we're sometimes spontaneous. And today we've actually got a special guest that's going to come in and join us at about 6:30, and it's none other than the architect of the framework of ambidexterity, Professor Charles O'Reilly from Stanford. So he's going to join our class. So you can sharpen your knives with some good questions for him in the next 30 minutes. Let me remind you that what we're covering today at a high level is what I'm calling related paradigms. By related paradigms, I mean other frameworks in strategic management that are kind of like dynamic capabilities. They're sympathetic to dynamic capabilities, but very rarely do they mention the word dynamic capabilities. And as I mentioned before, there's this great tendency amongst those of us in the scholarly world, and those of us in the consulting world too, for that matter, to peddle one's own ideas as a silver bullet solution to everything, and not bother to relate them to what anybody else has to say. Well, I think that's profoundly unproductive thing to do, and it causes intellectual confusion and confusion when it comes to implementing ideas. And so what I want to do for most of the rest of our class is talk about other paradigms that are related to dynamic capabilities, that are fellow bedfellows, if you will, but nevertheless have got something else to say that's a little bit different, something else to contribute. But of course, in my arrogant way, I think they're all embedded or fall under the umbrella of dynamic capabilities. But that's simply because dynamic capabilities is the more general framework. So with that, let me just briefly introduce you to tonight's guest of honor, my good friend and colleague from Stanford, Charles O'Reilly. I've poked fun at Michael Porter at Harvard because of the static nature of his framework. You won't find me poking fun at Professor Riley for those reasons, because his framework is as dynamic as mine. His focus, along with his colleague Mike Tushman, is on innovation. The main difference between the two of us is just simply a difference in emphasis. The Professor O'Reilly tends to focus a lot more on the organizational aspects of change. In fact, that's his background. He has a background in organizational psychology, and he understands change management way more profoundly than I do. He also understands the role of leadership. And in fact, the reason why these ideas are featured in dynamic capabilities is because actually Professor O'Reilly was at Berkeley for many years, and so I got to know him quite well, and he had a big influence on my own thinking. So I would say of all the paradigms out there that are close to dynamic capabilities, Professor O'Reilly's work on ambidexterity and on this latest book, Lead and Disrupt, are amongst the closest. And to give you some sense of how big these ideas are, I learned today that in Japan alone, this Lead and Disrupt book has sold over 50,000. So that's really good for Japan. It's really good for a worldwide level, but it's clearly, hit a note in Japan where, large organizations are having trouble changing and embracing what I call the new digital technology. Although you may remember, we discussed the fact that Fuji's done a better job than Kodak at dealing with digital transformation. So it's not like all Japanese firms are struggling with transformation. Some have actually done quite well. So before we bring on Professor O'Reilly in 30 minutes, let's just take a few minutes to review what the key components are of this ambidexterity concept. And then I'm going to take this very slide I'm showing you and essentially redline it to bring it into compatibility with dynamic capabilities. But his framework, and don't pay attention to the exploitation and exploration across the top. Pay attention to the left-hand column, ideation, incubation, and scaling. So, we've of course talked about sensing and sense-making as a way to identify, new opportunities and threats, and to formulate strategy as part of the diagnosis and strategy formulation process leading up to investment in new ventures. And so he, instead of using the language of sensing and sense-making, talks about ideation. But you'll notice the first bullet point in ideation is open innovation. And then he talks about corporate venture capital, getting these ideas from the startup world. And importantly, and something I don't emphasize enough, which is design thinking. Why design thinking? Well, because design thinking is a way in which you connect user needs to new product concepts and new product prototypes. And, in the South Bay, we have IDEO, which is, the poster child for design thinking company. He's also got in there, for some reason, employee involvement. And clearly, getting ideas from employees, that's what I consider to be open innovation. All of this is to tell you that it's rather hard to work through sometimes disparate literatures and ideas that seem to be disparate, but when you dig through the vocabulary and the terminology, you find actually a lot of commonality, and that can help a lot. And then he goes on to talk about, well, you get the ideation step done, then you move on to incubation. You take these ideas and you incubate them in some fashion. And there he references lean startup, which is Steve Blank, of course, our Berkeley colleague. Well, he actually splits his time between Berkeley and Stanford, but he's on neither faculty, but works with both. The business canvas is about getting the business model right. And the launchpad idea is about identifying customer pain points, et cetera, which is really all part of what I consider to be getting the business model right. And then he talks about scaling. Okay, you've got to, spread these ideas and you got to execute. And that's, of course, in dynamic capabilities, what we call seizing. But those of you who are consultants or in the workplace might actually find this list more pragmatic than what I've given you. And indeed, I think in some ways it is. There's a roadmap there for the kinds of things that you need to do in a large organization in order to innovate. But let's back up for a moment. This whole idea of ambidexterity is that the company has to do new things while at the same time it continues with what it's traditionally been doing. As President Jerry Ford once said, he admitted, he says, I have trouble walking and chewing gum at the same time. And he was self-deprecating humor from an American president. But really, ambidexterity says companies have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Although walking presumably is the traditional or the old technology, and chewing gum is the new technology. But why should it be so difficult? Why should it be so difficult? Because as we know, you can trivialize it and we can all walk and chew gum. But why can't organizations do it? Well, we've talked about that in this class, and we talked about dynamic capabilities and the fact that the enemy of the new is the old. And it's the rules. It's the rules that large bureaucracies create for themselves, not for the sake of creating rules, but in the quest for efficiency and predictability. Organizations love efficiency and employees love predictability. That, makes management easier. So organizations tend to, build routines and rules, and, they become the enemy. Now, what we're looking at here from Professor O'Reilly doesn't actually tell you what the enemy is. It just tells you what you got to do. And over on the right, he goes on to explain that you must have scale and ambition, the scale of ambition. You must define hunting zones. So when he says hunting zones, he's talking strategy. He doesn't use the word strategy, but hunting zone is, okay, this is the area in which I'm going to go looking for new ideas. I'm not going to look helter-skelter. I'm not going to be completely opportunistic. I'm going to focus. And then over on the right under exploration, he has hypothesis testing, et cetera, all of these other issues about how you manage this and bring some discipline to this incubation process. And then with respect to scaling, he goes on the right-hand side to talk about building capacity and building capabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when Professor O'Reilly comes in, I hope you can quiz him about, is this a recipe? Is this general advice? Is this general guidelines? And I'm sure he's going to have good answers to that because he spent a lot of time looking at companies that succeed and at companies that fail. But I hope you can see there that this is related to dynamic capability, but not exactly the same. So here is what I did today to Professor O'Reilly's diagram, or his table 1. First of all, I don't think it adds anything to distinguish between exploitation and exploration, so I X'd that out across the top. And with respect to sensing, everything that he talked about in that first category relating to ideation is what we call sensing. But you'll notice that even though he's talking about innovation, he doesn't have research and development anywhere in the equation. Even our Haas colleague, Professor Chesbrough, the champion of open innovation, sees open innovation and in-house R&D as being complements, not substitutes. So perhaps we can politely suggest to Professor O'Reilly that research and development ought to be part of the ideation. That's one way you get ideas. You need ideas both to define the research path, but secondly, if you have discovery through research and development, then that is in fact discovery through research and development. Is that not part of ideation is a question I'll put to him. And I'm sure you've got some questions to put to him that are better than that, but that's one to start him off with. And then, what he calls incubation and scaling, I think that translates into what we call, seizing. These are just different steps. I mean, really what he's doing is providing some granularity for how you go about doing this. And Jeff Immelt at GE, we'll ask Charles about this because he studied it. He just got fired because he actually tried to apply, one of the things he tried to do was apply the lean startup model to GE. He was determined to turn GE into a software company. And guess what? It didn't seem to work. And he had Eric Ries in lean startup, as, a $10 or $20 million a year spend to try and do all of this, exactly this kind of stuff in GE, and it didn't work. So one thing for sure we should ask Professor O'Reilly about is why didn't it work? Because I think his colleague, Michael Tushman at Harvard, has just finished a case study on that, so we'll be amongst the first to hear about it. So let me just pause there for a moment and ask you, what do you think of these 3 disciplines of ambidexterity? Is it enough? Is he telling us here he's telling us what to do, the new things to do, but he's not telling us, is he, how to make this compatible with what the company's currently doing. What about the existing organizational structure? How are we going to live? How are we going to modify that? Are we going to create a separate subsidiary to do all this new stuff? Or does it have to be done? Does it have to be done, inside the existing organization? There's a lot of questions here that I'm sure this already is suggesting to you. But let me pause to see if you have any questions before we spend a few more minutes to go into some of the details of what I think Professor O'Reilly has in mind, and no doubt what he will talk about in a few minutes. Anyone want to have a stab at this? David, are you trying to say something there? Maybe if you unmute.
I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to form a thought here. I guess like the one thing on this that stands out to me was maybe like in the stage one of seizing governance. I think if I remember right, in the dynamic capabilities framework, that usually happened at the end with transformation. So I guess maybe one thing that could be an issue there is like if you have leaders that are have anti-cannibalization proclivities, like they might not want to arrange certain assets in certain ways to take advantage of new business opportunities. So they could get in the way of what you are trying to do seizing wise.
Yeah, well, and it's not directly addressed here. So let's go on a little bit more into the paper that I didn't ask you to do any reading for today because you were so burdened with the exam. But I've got a few points here from the article I did assign by O'Reilly and Binns. And so first of all, he points out that they looked at 100 companies and 92% of them claimed to have something going in the way of, addressing new opportunities and new technologies. IBM, which by the way is not doing well as a company, nevertheless has 1,600 trained designers operating in 44 studios. So they're making an effort, but it doesn't seem to be doing them much good. So maybe Professor O'Reilly and myself, we're wrong that maybe they should just throw the towel in, and you can't change these big organizations. And point three says, look, Qualcomms of the world have used hackathons to unleash creativity. So companies, this is documenting companies are doing stuff. They're trying hard. Open source, open innovation, hackathons, lean startup, all of this stuff is having an impact, and companies are experimenting, but not too much is happening. Why have the results not been impressive? Asked Professor Riley. Why have more companies not cracked the code of disruptive innovation? So this to me is the big conundrum. So, it's like we're sprinkling flowers on the water, but doing not much more than this. But O'Reilly's answer is one important reason is that firms have not appreciated the need to manage discontinuous and incremental innovation differently. Okay, so they're using, by implication, they're using old methods for new situations. Incremental innovation enables companies to do the important work of developing new products, extending the life of existing ones, refining existing processes. In contrast, discontinuous innovation helps firms to develop new capabilities, often selling to new customer sets. So it's not just a matter about doing the existing stuff a little better and a little differently. It's about addressing entirely new things. So I think he's hinting there that you can't just use incremental routines. You've got to do some kind of a break. So let's see what else he tells us. Driving disruptive innovation requires firms to be ambidextrous. Okay. You got to exploit and explore at the same time. Okay. This requires mastery of three distinct skills, and this is where he gets the idea generation, incubation, and scaling. Okay, he doesn't tell us. He says management too often concentrate on the first two of these disciplines and have neglected the third. I would have thought the scaling up part would be the easier part, but we'll ask him more about that. But he doesn't tell us anywhere in here how you master managing the old and the new. So he goes on to give us lots of examples from Amazon and elsewhere. So one question I've got for him, and I'm sure you'll have different ones, is, okay, so we got to do all of this stuff, but if ambidexterity is about managing the old and the new together, how do you do it? Do you teach everybody? Do you have the whole company focused on idea generation? Do you have a breakout unit? Do you have to change the entire culture or part of the culture? He's hiding the ball a little bit, at least so far. So let's see if we go on a bit further. Got examples from Amazon. He's got examples from IBM and their emerging business opportunities activity. And he shows that, profitability is out into the future. Yes, that's no big surprise. But so let's look at his last bullet here. We've got to balance opposing factors to imagine future possibilities that are currently unrecognized market needs. Yes, and then he says, understand the organizational politics, adopt an affiliate leadership style. So we're getting here, finally, we're getting some clues as to how you change the culture and so forth. All right, so I think it's time. Let's just pause and I want each one of you to have a question for Professor O'Reilly. So now it's time to try them. There's no question's a bad question. So why don't you, I can't see many of you there, but I can see Christian, I can see Nicholas, maybe, and Tetsuya over there. Maybe you can all, one after the other, quickly indicate a question you might have for Professor O'Reilly, and I'll give you whatever quick feedback I have on it before you have the chance to meet him in person here in a few minutes. Anyone?
Yeah, Professor Teece, I had a question. Something that we read in the Intel case, one of the reasons why they found, some of these innovation initiatives didn't work previously at Intel was that the leadership just, got impatient. So they didn't give these startup ideas enough time to incubate and actually bring results in. They used to, allocate some sums of money, they set up targets. And when they saw that, they just weren't making enough money, they used to shut these, ideas or startups down, which takes us back to ordinary capabilities. That these are metrics or KPIs that you would see in an ordinary capability framework. What is the sort of ROI on my investment? Do you think that has any, any role in any of this as to why some of these ideas fail?
Well, yeah, I can't recall exactly what got shut down, but I do know that one of the things, and I actually recommended this to Intel that they shut down, they were Johnny-come-lately into the mobile, the modem space themselves. They missed the chance with the iPhone to do the modem for Apple, and they were spending billions and had no chance to catch up with Qualcomm. And yeah, sometimes when you're in that kind of position, it is the right thing to pull the plug. On the other hand, if they had been in there earlier and taken some risks, they could have done it with millions of dollars instead of billions of dollars. So it's very hard to say. I mean, look, it is true that if you let the finance guys get too close to new initiatives, they almost always will kill it. And you need a champion and a leader, and usually the founder or somebody who's got incredible credibility to carry you through. So yeah, one of the things we should ask Charles is, how do you overcome the NPV mentality? Because that comes from the old side of the house. And we all know that you got to turn a deaf ear to it, but there's very few companies that actually do so. And boards of directors, in fact, are not helpful. So that's a great question to keep up your sleeve. I'd love to hear Charles's response. So, okay, that's one good one. We got another one? Anybody else?
I can go. I would be really curious about learning how to pick your milestones and because often companies are too ambitious in their early phases, in the scaling phase, and they pick the wrong milestones. They don't meet them. The initiative is stopped. How do you pick the right ones and also not go too easy on yourself either?
Right. So the whole idea of milestones is to try and bring some amount of accountability. I mean, the fundamental challenge here, and it's what drives the CFO nuts, is, how do you bring accountability to something new? If you bring too much accountability, it disappears. But if you don't bring enough, then even a good idea will flounder. So that's another great question. So keep that one up your sleeve. Anybody else?
Hi, Professor Andy King.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear his perspective from an organizational psychology point of view regarding optimal organization size. I know, Safi Bakal's book kind of talks about the optimal size being around 150 people at most before, politics kind of take over and it changes the nature of the culture. And I'd be curious to hear his perspective on that and if you could give us any guidance.
Yeah, it's a very good one. And honestly, there's no better person that I know than Charles O'Reilly to talk about the culture and the limits of culture. That's really one of his great contributions to the literature. Okay. Anybody else?
Hey, Professor. I guess in similar vein as what Andrew was saying is like, I guess there's probably a point where all startups, they go down this path, but then they lose their ambidexterity, right? Like they might have like a more mature product. So how they keep staying innovative and like, I guess what are best practices that companies can employ to stay ambidextrous and not just grow into a mature company that loses their ability to be innovative.
Right. Well, so once you start scaling up, that when you scale up, that's when you got to create rules, because that's when efficiency kind of starts to matter. So once you get scale up, you create more and more rules, more and more standard operating procedures. You bring more process to bear. You bring more standardization to bear, because that's how you get to be efficient. And the question is, how far down that path? So he has these nice little diagrams. Where were they? Horizon 1, mature business, growth business, future business. We can probe him a little bit more on what this all means. To me, it reads, I would read it the other way. The future business is where you got milestones. The metrics for future business is milestones. The metric for growth business is market share, and the metric for mature businesses is profit margins. So I think what he's going to say is the only time you use MPV and typical standard accounting measures is when you've got a mature business. That's what he's saying here. And so the question for him as a culture maven is, how do you keep the CFO's nose out of the game when you're over here on the future businesses?
Professor,
anybody else?
I'm curious to hear how this would look from an internal communications perspective, right? I think it's one thing to say that you kind of moderate internal resistance to this new venture. from employees that aren't involved with it. But how exactly does that look? You can have a senior executive champion it, but oftentimes I find that, there are groups within a larger organization that are against the new venture. Your sales team doesn't really want to sell it, things like that. So I'd be curious to hear how this is best communicated throughout an organization.
Well, that's a great question, and communications is critical, and it's part of maintaining the culture and extending the culture, and it's part of the leadership too. So, yeah, put that one to him as well, please. Anybody else got a question or two? Okay, well, when he comes on, what I will ask him to do, which should be any minute now, is to just talk a little bit about ambidexterity and lead and disrupt, and then I'll tell him that you've got some questions for him. So you'll get a chance to put your questions to him directly, and I'm sure based on whatever 5 or 10 minutes he says, some of you will come up with some more questions, and if you don't, I will. But I know you will. And let's just go on a little bit more here. His co-author here, J.M. Binns, is ex-IBM, and IBM had this emerging business, EBOs, emerging business opportunities, which was a process. So they actually designed a process to deal with all of this. I've got some doubts about how successful it was, but the very question about, can you turn this process into rules is itself a good one. I mean, the companies that have been more systematic about it, like IBM, and done better than the companies that are more spontaneous. If there are any big companies that are spontaneous, I suspect you'll tell us there's almost no big companies that are spontaneous, and that you need this process and you need buy-in from top management. Otherwise, the CFO is going to come in and kill the new initiatives anyway. So it would be good to find out a little bit more about that IBM process. This is the article we just talked about. But this is also a very provocative statement. The first sentence here: for large firms, simply to act like a startup is not enough to guarantee success. I mean, first of all, I would question whether any big firm can act like a startup. They can mimic various elements of a startup, but I think it's almost an impossibility. Their fundamental proposition is that for new ideas, even those with demonstrated market acceptance to become new businesses, they require leaders to master all 3 disciplines. So that's the ideate, incubate, and scale is the 3 disciplines. For us, of course, it's sensing, seizing, and transforming. So he's got the 3 eyes, well, not the 3 eyes, 2 eyes and 1 ass, and we got 3 S's. So are we talking the same language? Well, we're not using the same language, but we're talking more or less the same ideas. But he says that only when all 3 are in place is it likely that new ideas will result in new businesses. Now, there's nothing in there about strategy. There's nothing in there about capturing value. There's nothing in there about, well, actually, there is something in there about business models. We saw that earlier. But there's nothing in there about strategy. And I know you can tease him about that because I have, and he's admitting that there's nothing in there about strategy. So let's think about a question that you can formulate to bring out his perspective on strategy. All right, so we're well waiting, and let's hope that he's not listening in on us and decided that he's going to go off in a huff. I'm sure that's not the case. So let's just wait for Charles to come on, and
Charles is here, and he's in a huff.
He's in a huff. There he is. So okay, well, we got some good questions for you, but we want to give you the opportunity of actually talking a little bit about lead and disrupt and ambidexterity, and maybe, tell us why you wrote lead and disrupt, and what's in lead and disrupt that is not already in ambidexterity, and maybe remind us a little bit about some of the successes and failures at IBM and GE and elsewhere, because I must admit that we haven't really talked about corporate examples at the level of detail that you have. You've written the cases, I have not, and your colleague, Mike Tushman, has written the cases, and we have not. So with that intro, please.
Sure. So first of all, it's great to be here. It's always a pleasure to listen to David. David is one of those very rare academics who actually has been out there and built organizations. So I pay attention to what David says. So the background on lead and disrupt really comes from a couple of places. One, very early. So Lou Gerstner in 2000, for those of you, many of you are not old enough to remember this, but Gerstner came to IBM in 1993, and the company was failing. Wall Street had written it off. They wanted it broken up in pieces and sold off. And Gerstner came in, and he had a different strategy, actually. He wanted to keep the company together, which, by the way, was the same strategy that John Akers had failed with. So there was no change in strategy here under Gerstner. So Gerstner came in, and by 2000, the company, he righted the company, but he got angry. And he got angry because they were getting ready for their annual spring plan, their strategy planning process, and they were under some margin pressure. And he noticed that all the businesses were cutting back on investment in the future. And so he turned to his head of strategy, a fellow named Bruce Harold, and he told Bruce that he wanted Bruce, Gerstner was tired of missing markets, and he wanted to know why IBM missed these markets. And so he had Bruce do a study. And the study identified 29 separate technologies that IBM had that they had failed to commercialize. I mean, so for instance, the first commercial router was not a Cisco router, it was an IBM router, but they missed these markets. And so they did a study of these 29 different technologies that they failed at. And they came up with two big reasons why they failed. First of all, they were so focused on today's businesses. All their metrics, all their mind share were focused on today's businesses. And it made sense because that's where they were making money. But it meant they lacked insight into the future. And it was even worse than that, because when they stumbled into some of these new businesses, they often failed because they had leaders who were great leaders of big businesses, but didn't know how to run entrepreneurial businesses. So they got Mike and I involved to help them rethink how they did strategy and execution. And that led to IBM thinking about strategy differently. It's great to have a right strategy, but unless you can align the organization to the strategy to execute it, it doesn't matter. I mean, Dick Kovacevic at Wells Fargo used to say a second-rate strategy perfectly executed will beat a first-rate strategy poorly executed. And so what we did is we helped them design a process that could basically leverage their assets and capabilities that came out of R&D in part, but also their channels of distribution, their manufacturing, the whole thing. And they called that process the emerging business opportunity process. That process led to a lot of what were the initial ideas in Lead and Disrupt. That process, by the way, generated $15 billion in top line growth for them over a 6-7 year period. So it was quite successful. The second part of Lead and Disrupt was a little bit more recently, actually. And every time, when I interacted with senior executives around innovation, it occurred to me that they had a pretty narrow definition about what innovation was. They typically saw it as coming up with new ideas, being like a startup. And they missed the opportunity. Let me give you one example. So I was in Japan 3 years ago, big Japanese electronics company. They had bought into design thinking in a big way. They spent several years and God knows how much money sort of in this design thinking process. And they were very proud of the fact that they'd come up with 400 ideas for new businesses and products. And I asked them, I said, well, how many of those have you actually made any money on? And they said 2. And so the confusion, I think, it occurred to me, was there are really 3 separate, as you've read, there are really 3 separate disciplines that you need. You've got to have a process that comes up with new ideas. You know, that's open innovation, that's design thinking, that's corporate venture capital. There are lots of ways to do that. And I think many companies have gotten pretty good at it. The second process is, how do you take all those ideas and decide which of those ideas might actually be profitable and scale in a market? And that's incubation. You know, and Lean Startup and Business Canvas, there are some great methodologies for doing that. But I was just on a phone call earlier today with Steve Blank of Lean Startup, and you know, he spent a lot of time with some big organizations that have adopted Lean Startup, and he acknowledges that typically doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, it ends up in what he calls innovation theater. We've spent all this money, we've got all these black belts, or you know, whatever we call them, but incubation doesn't tell you how to scale a business. And that's, to me, where the real issue comes in. That is, how do you make sure that given that you've got a business which can grow and scale and not be commoditized, capture value from it, how do you make sure that you get the assets and capabilities to run that business? And typically, as I'm sure David has talked to you about, typically what happens is most people are willing to do the ideation and incubation. You know, get some entrepreneurial leader, send them off to the side, have fun, develop some new ideas. We were in Germany 18 months ago. Audi has an amazing operation in both Munich and Berlin. They're great at ideation and incubation. There's no way in hell they're going to scale, because they're run by a bunch of leaders who are internal combustion engineers. So the question then becomes, what does it take to really scale these businesses? That's kind of what the origins are of Lead and Disrupt. You know, my belief has always been, and I don't know whether David agrees or disagrees with this, and certainly Edith Penrose would agree with this, that big organizations ought to be more innovative than smaller organizations for a bunch of reasons. They've got more experience, they've got more access to customers, they can run more experiments, they typically have greater technological expertise. But the evidence is, of course, they often are not. And so why are they not more innovative? And it's not, I think it's not for lack of strategy. I mean, David and I would have a nice argument about this. You know, it's not for a lack of strategy. I mean, it's because they don't know how to run 2 separate organizations at the same time to explore and exploit. So is that sufficient background, David?
Yeah, but tell us how you keep the dogs away, so to speak. You know, you've made the point that, you know, in the Audi context, you know, the gearheads will kill the new businesses. The CFO is always running around with a sharp pencil, asking why you're spending money on this. You've done so much on organizational culture. Do you have to change the whole culture? Do you have to create a separate breakout unit? What's the right way to make sure the old doesn't kill the new?
So culture is a part of it, and I'm going to resist the temptation to show you some slides here. Culture is part of it, but if you think about culture for what it really is, it's a social control system in organizations. You go to work in an organization, you want to fit in, you want to figure out how to do the right thing. It's important to figure out what are the behaviors that are considered positive and what are the behaviors that are considered negative. And so if culture is a social control system, the culture you need in a big exploit organization, if I go into an Intel fab, that is all about yield. It is all about Six Sigma. It's all about driving, variance reduction. Right? And I want a culture that values that. I want short-term, rapid feedback learning. I want people who are compliant with all the processes, copy exact. If I go into a business that is, just beginning to scale, and maybe product market fit isn't there, or maybe we don't quite know kind of who our ultimate customer set's going to be, I need a completely different culture. I need a culture that sort of is more tolerant of risk, that is more sort of long-term, that's more flexible, it's got more initiative to it. So the issue of culture is important, but it is often not the case that you need to transform the entire culture. What you need are leaders who are able to manage different cultures under the same vision and values.
Right. So in dynamic capabilities, we say you need entrepreneurial managers, which of course is almost an oxymoron, but you do find them from time to time. And you've taught me that it's the top management team that matters. Not every individual doesn't have to have all of this, but the team has to have this sort of both the ability to run the old and support the new. So that's not just culture; it's also the people, and none of us talk about the role of boards, but if you don't have a supportive board, they'll help the CFO kill everything new as well.
Yeah. But you need entrepreneurial managers. That's certainly, you need managers who know how to run entrepreneurial businesses. That's clear. But you also need managers who know how to run big, mature businesses. What ambidexterity is about is a senior leadership team that can appreciate the tensions and the differences in running those two. So you can have a senior, we've seen lots of them, you can have a senior leader who is not entrepreneurial, but who can in fact appreciate what it takes to run those businesses. Let me give you a recent example. Intel is in deep shit. We all know that. That they're under existential threat. Their server business is under threat. Their personal computer business is certainly flat and not likely to grow. They were headed up until a couple months ago by a guy named Bob Swan. Bob Swan was the chief financial officer.
Right.
But Bob Swan has empowered a group called EGI, Economic Growth, Entrepreneurial Growth Initiatives. They've got a leader of that business who is a 4-time entrepreneur. They are scaling. They've already scaled one business to a $1 billion valuation. So the guy who runs that business has got to be entrepreneurial. The senior team has to appreciate that they're going to have to operate very differently. Just to give you one trivial example, because many of you have experience and you've witnessed this. So the guy who's running the entrepreneurial business at Intel, he wants to buy a bunch of pizzas. What do the purchasing people say? Well, you can't spend that much money on pizza. You got to submit a request. It's like, give me a break here. So it's the systems and processes that help you run a big business are often exactly those that will kill a small business. So it's leadership, it's culture, and it's the metrics and processes.
Well, I think we agree, and you're providing a lot of granularity that's missing currently from dynamic capabilities. Let me go. I want to put up a slide that, I wanted to take your slide here and show you that, the ideas are very, very compatible, but the words are sometimes different. And, let me ask you, you don't mention research and development as a way to ideate. I mean, yes, both the activity of directing R&D, but R&D itself can generate new opportunities. So for me, at least, and for companies that do have an R&D capability, where does that fit into your framework? That was my first.
So it's a little tricky, David, and for the following reason. Our R&D fundamentally develops new technologies, new processes. They're not in the business of generating new businesses. That's not their mindset.
Right.
They often develop technologies that are useful for incremental advances, which doesn't mean that they're necessarily not risky. They can be quite risky, and they can be very expensive. When Boeing puts out a new airframe, they're on the same technological trajectory. It's a big risk. Are the customers going to buy it? It's very expensive, but fundamentally, and what R&D does, I think you cannot rely on R&D for new businesses because they will come up with new ideas that are for businesses that the company has no interest in, and so the people will leave and they'll go found some startup. Let me give you an example of how R&D can be very powerful. So NEC is a big Japanese IT company. They are really at the forefront. Most of you wouldn't know it, but they're at the forefront of AI ML. What they are doing is they have set up what's called NECX here in Silicon Valley, where they take their technology and twice a year they have these showcases where the R&D labs, they've got R&D labs around the world, bring in technology. It's not ideas. This is technology that has actually had proof of concept. And then they bring in potential entrepreneurs in residence, and they match the technology with the entrepreneur in residence, who can now take that technology and scale a business that may be a very different business from what NEC is used to. So I think R&D can be exceedingly powerful. We last, I guess in January, we were in Japan. There's a big Japanese company called Asahi, it used to be called Asahi Glass Company. Think about the glass business. The glass business is miserable. It's commoditized fundamentally. They've got architectural glass, which is building glass, and then they've got automotive glass. Those businesses grow at GDP. There's no additional growth in those businesses. But it is a company that has extraordinarily deep technology in material science. And what they have done is they have decided to be ambidextrous. They are actually leveraging their technology out of R&D into new material science. So they're into life sciences, they're into mobility. So R&D, I think, can be a source of great advantage. But most R&D labs are not. And look at the failures, David. Look at AT&T. They did amazing things. AT&T never made any money.
Bell Labs. I mean, in fact, NEC copied the model of Bell Labs, and that's why they got big R&D labs. But AT&T, Bell Labs, really drove most of the innovation in the telecommunications industry through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But of course, it wasn't trying to make money. It was a regulated industry, and it was, trying to.
So look at Xerox. Look at Xerox PARC.
Yeah.
What did Xerox make out of that?
Well, that's the case where they get the sensing part right, which that they saw that computer science and computing was the future, that the digital world was the future. But then the idiots back in Connecticut sat around doing acquisitions, and they when it came to the implementation, they weren't willing to spend the money. They'd just blown $1 billion on an acquisition, and their company was in turmoil. But you're right. I mean, you're right that a lot of companies, when it comes to writing the big checks, I mean, writing the check for Xerox PARC is relatively small. It was like $100 million a year. But when you got to implement this stuff, you're talking about $1 billion a year, and that's a lot of check, right?
Amazon has what I think is a really interesting model here, because we sometimes get asked, how much does this cost? How much did IBM spend on this? Okay, they generated $15 billion in top line growth. How much did they spend? Well, they didn't want to part with the numbers, but I kept hammering on them, and they were spending about $100 million a year. Intel spending about $200 million. It's not trivial, but it's not a big number. Amazon does this. And this is the genius, I think, of the kind of lean startup. The whole idea is you do lots of these low cost experiments. What Amazon says is, what Bezos says, look, think about one and two-way doors. That is, a two-way door you can go through, and if it doesn't work, you can come back out. You want to do very large numbers of those types of experiments. A one-way door is going to be expensive, and so you don't want to spend a lot of money to do that. So I think the point I guess I'm trying to make here is you can do a lot of experiments using the kind of lean startup business canvas methodology without spending a whole lot of money.
Yep. Well, actually, your economic historian now passed away. Nate Rosenberg has a paper in the ICC called Economic Experiments, which is about capitalism. I mean, the very essence of capitalism and the way it works is that you can experiment, and it's okay to fail, just so long as you got enough successes.
What Bezos says two things that I think are relevant here. One he says that you know, because we're a big company, not a small company, we can do lots and lots of experiments. And by the way, numbers matter when you start to do experiments. And the other thing he says is big winners pay for lots of losers. If you look at Amazon Web Services, I think last year was a $32 billion business. You know, that came out of a couple little experiments internally of making their platform more accessible initially internally, and then some smart person, you know, Jassy, said, "Shit, we can make this open to other people." If you look at so I think small experiments, lots of small experiments, is probably, you know, ceteris paribus.
Right, but you're not betting the company on any one of them. But I do give Bezos a lot of credit for, he could have taken profits a heck of a lot earlier and not spent as much money experimenting, but he kept pedal to the metal and kept experimenting. And, you know, Wall Street thought he was crazy, but he was in fact way smarter than they were.
I was in a meeting. If I hadn't been in this meeting, this is now 3 years ago, if I hadn't been in this meeting and somebody told me about it, I wouldn't believe it. It was a meeting with the CEO and three of his senior managers, and they had what was pretty clear to be $1 billion opportunity, but it would require taking assets and capabilities away from their existing business. And what this CEO said to me, he said, look, I got 3 years left in the job. My compensation is predicated on stock price. If I take assets, if I take people and money away from these existing businesses, that's going to affect the stock price. He said, I'm not going to do it, which is great because he's now on my list.
Yeah. Oh, it's very sad. I mean, that's the question is, why can't public markets, you know, reward that? And the answer is that there's too many traders out there. There's not enough stockholders. Look, I know the students have got some questions for you. And this is absolutely fantastic having you here as a guest. We're very, very privileged. And Christian, you want to start first? Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Go right ahead.
I actually changed my question. I'll ask my original question later. Sorry, because based on what you said earlier. So thanks for being here, Professor Riley. So, look, I'm an engineering leader at a subsidiary to Microsoft at LinkedIn, and I really love what you said about innovation theater. I'm curious if you had to look at IBM today, you talk about IBM back when they had their crisis in the 90s, early 2000s. What would they need to do to kind of turn their company around? They're not putting out a lot of new business or product lines lately, and their stock price has been stalling a lot.
Yeah. So we were there from 2007, and I stayed in touch with people until they began to retire in about 2010. So they had this EBO process. What happened when Jeannie Rometty replaced Palmisano? She was developing billion-dollar businesses, and she said, that's not enough. I said, I need $10 billion. And so she took a set of these EBOs. Watson, their AI product, is really a combination of 3 of these EBOs. And she took these 3 EBOs and she put them together and she said, go get me $10 billion. And it didn't work. And so they killed the process. I don't know where they are today. I guess they've now placed a bet on hybrid cloud, but they're running fourth probably in that market. So
But why didn't it work? Can you reverse engineer the reasons for the failure?
we weren't there, so I don't know, and I'm sure there are technical reasons as well. When I was speaking to people who were potential customers of Watson, they told me, they said, look, it's a more marketing thing. It's just not, they're not delivering the results. So it could be technically, it's just not, they haven't quite gotten there yet. But Christian, you're at Microsoft. I mean, Nadella's done a remarkable job. That I think, unless you tell me differently, Christian, that he actually has transformed the culture in the company. So,
I agree. Yeah, so I work in. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So I work at LinkedIn, in this LinkedIn subsidiary, and we were actually very surprised when we were acquired by Microsoft in 2016. We thought we had seen, what happened to Nokia and to Skype and other companies. We're like, oh no, what's going to happen here? But it was a very different approach under his leadership. We've been very much left to our own devices and done integration where it was meaningful and not been forced with our hand behind around our back to migrate everything to Microsoft. So I think it's been great to see. It's a great transformation since the Steve Ballmer and those years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Charles, while we're on that, I couldn't understand why Gates left Ballmer in there. I know he's a graduate of OB school, but Ballmer seemed to have none of the things that you and I would think of as being right for, keeping innovation stoked. And he's bombastic. He was, narcissistic and all of those things. Why did a smart guy like Gates keep him there? And what's your view of Ballmer's period? Clearly, the stock price was flat. That's not necessarily a bad thing if he's investing for the future, but he wasn't.
Yeah. So I think about Hewlett Packard and the transition when they went from Lou Platt to Carly Fiorina and then Mark Hurd. What they did, and I think this is true, I'm guessing that this is true of what you're talking about. What HP did was they brought in Fiorina, and they had a very decentralized organization. They had 50 plus divisions. Every division basically had 70% of their revenue and management attention was on today's products, 20% were on growth products, 10% were on sort of potential explore projects. So it was a company that constantly threw up innovations. What Fiorina did was she centralized it. And when she brought in Hurd is just one of these great, operators of driving costs out. And I suspect that's what Ballmer did, that he didn't innovate and he drove the business to perform in their existing businesses. And he just missed a bunch of things. I mean, their three main markets, Microsoft's three main markets were under existential threat. Office, Windows, and their server business. And he's managed to transform the entire company. It's almost a substitution event, David. They've almost gone from the old desktops and server stuff to the cloud. So I think that's what Ballmer did. Ballmer was an executor.
And would you put Tim Cook into the same category?
Yes, absolutely. Ask yourself, and maybe somebody here is from Apple, and you can call me on this, but what has Apple innovated that's not an incremental innovation?
Yeah, I agree.
In the last 10 years, they're making tons of money, and the stock market loves them. But
well, it's amazing. I mean, the Jobs sort of gave them three great product categories and an ecosystem and a bunch of services that in fact maybe for the next 20 years, it was ideally teed up for execution. But the next 20 years beyond where we are now, not so clear.
Yeah. One of the students said that they pivoted to be a software company, so maybe that's it, but I'm not sure where they're making money on software. It's this balance.
Yeah. We have some other questions there, I know. Jackie?
Yeah, sure, I can ask mine. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. I was wondering, you, in one of the slides that Professor Teece posted earlier, you mentioned that an important part of innovative culture was moderating kind of resistance from other parts of the organization. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how to do that. Is it just having a strong championship from a senior leader? And kind of how do you deal with it at lower levels where, for instance, your sales team may not want to sell a new product? Want to manage.
Yeah, we saw SAP screw that up because of that. So that's why I think in the end it requires senior leaders. It requires when the Explore businesses run into these problems, like purchasing at Intel or like access to customers so when SAP was trying to initially move into software as a service, one of the big blockages was their relationship managers didn't want these software as a service guys coming in and selling lower margin products to their existing customers. So it's not just money, budget, it's also access to customers and technology, brand, manufacturing, whatever. And unless there's a process that allows the Explore unit to go to the senior management and say, you got to cut us some slack here, we're gonna fail. Unless they have that, the mature business will all too often kill the small business. I think it's not solvable. I mean, there are political skills of leaders that can help you buffer that or manage that. But I think for the long term, it requires a senior team that is willing to buffer the Explore units. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's come back to Amazon with Bezos stepping up into this executive chair role. And you got a good implementer coming in. I mean, it's the same model. Is it not? It's a Tim Cook model again.
So I don't know Jassy, but you know, Jassy's one of the good things about Amazon is the strength of their culture. And Jassy and some of the other senior managers have been there for a long time. So that culture, it's a culture that promotes innovation. It's this PR fact process, this ideation, incubation, scaling. I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to go away. I think Jassy is so steeped in that culture. That's different from the transition at Hewlett Packard from Lou Platt to Carly Fiorina, where she knew nothing about the culture. She made some structural decisions that basically destroyed the culture. I don't think that's going to happen at Amazon.
But think about bringing Fiorina in. That's a board mistake because, you know, the whole philosophy of HP was decentralization, innovation. Yeah. And then somehow or other, someone persuaded them, well, you know, and she did the Compact acquisition too, if I remember right. It's all about scale.
She did, yeah.
All about scale. I mean, if you had been asked whether that was the right strategy, forgetting about the person, what would you have said back then?
So I think one needs to be appropriately modest here. I mean, the problem that I heard from people who were at HP at the time was that this is a period when systems needed to be integrated. And because they had such a decentralized structure, they had all these systems and they weren't leveraging, you know, their IT systems, you know, lots of different systems. And so the idea was that she had was we need to figure out a way to leverage and integrate these systems. So if that's one of the major problems you're dealing, that now the question becomes harder, right? Because how do you keep the decentralized part and sort of deal with some of the some of the integration issues. So I think, David, you and I, when you have your academic hat on, we have the benefit of hindsight. So it's easy for us to look back and say, you know, it was pretty, at the time, I think it was a hard decision. But I agree with you completely that the board screwed it up.
I want to come back to your first opening comment, which is, in theory, and you mentioned Edith Penrose, who wrote this excellent book. She was here at Berkeley, actually. All the great ideas come out of Berkeley, don't they, Charles? For some reason, I don't know why.
Go Bears.
But she said that, look, big firms have got, you know, generic resources, and if they've got an excess management, then they can successfully diversify. And so, yes, you're right. There's all kinds of reasons because of capabilities that you would think big firms are diversified. And in fact, and would be successful in innovation. And in fact, they did. You know, think about GE, think about Westinghouse, think about General Motors. But that was sort of before a VC industry was around. You know, you had the Rockefellers out there with private money and so forth, but it's very hard to do a startup. So in a way, big companies only had to compete with other big companies, and because that's where the capabilities were. But now with VC, you're actually running a different horse race. That you have the opportunity. Small companies are no longer undercapitalized. In fact, there's so much venture capital money out there that it's often said the startups are better capitalized than, you know, anybody trying to start up a new business inside of a large company. Not only in terms of the fact that the VCs will throw more money at them, but there's just more money available in the VC community than there is in the corporate headquarters to fund new initiatives. So it's a different structure of the market. And so, yes, they should continue to be innovative, but one shouldn't be surprised that newcos outside of existing structures, not having to battle the old side of the business, do seem to do very well.
Yes, but you know, so take any big company, especially a technology company where you've got lots of smart engineers. You know, are there people in that company that would like to be entrepreneurial, but by the way, would also like some health insurance? Sure. I mean, so I think you're right that the venture capital industry has made it easier for people to leave companies. But I think companies, I mean, so when Intel started this EGI process, we could talk more about it if you're interested, but you know, they had a nice process to solicit ideas. They got 500 ideas, and the people within the company are excited. You know, my guess would be in any company, you know, I'm looking at Christian here. If we went to LinkedIn and said, you know, gee, you know, we've got this process. If you've got some interesting ideas that you think could develop a business, we've got a process that we can run you through, sort of ideation, incubation, scaling. And we're going to design a compensation system, by the way, that'll allow you to make a bunch of money. Would you like to do that within the company? Yeah, the answer is yes. I think that's an advantage that the big companies have not really done. They've not tapped into that.
Yeah, well, they've tried from time to time. I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, GE set up GE New Ventures, and Exxon had Exxon Enterprises. But actually, one of the reasons I heard why GE shut down GE Ventures is because the antitrust guys, every time they do a merger, would say, "Oh, you got something incubating over there, so that's you're a potential competitor. So sorry, we can't let you do the acquisition." So there were those kinds of regulatory issues which came into play as well.
Yeah.
But Charles, before you leave, maybe you can come back and look at the diagram that we have up at the table one. Does it make any sense to try and integrate dynamic capabilities and ambidexterity and so forth? I mean, these ideas are all very compatible. The benefit of integration, who is anybody going to benefit from putting these ideas together? Have we created so much confusion out there that nobody can get it right? Do we do a benefit to society by standardizing
more theory. That's so. I think David and you and I have talked about this, and I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to talk about this. I think what you have with dynamic capabilities, and you've rightfully criticized us for this, is you have a much better sense for the strategy and the value capture than what we have. You know, I say we, Andy Binns and Mike Tushman and I, we've been focused on, you know, we're managers at heart, basically. How do you make this happen within an organization? So we really haven't talked about the strategy part. And I think I would push you to help us think more about the kind of strategy part of this and the value capture and the business model part of it. I think we understand at some level of granularity how to make this happen within an organization, and I don't think you do under dynamic capabilities. It's always been kind of a source of puzzlement to me because you have all this experience as an operating manager, but when you take dynamic capabilities, it seems to me, at least from a distance, that you haven't really operationalized them in any sort of granular way. And so I think the compatibility here is for us to think hard, you and I, to think hard about, okay, let's say what ambidexterity can bring to dynamic capabilities is kind of in this chart. We kind of understand how to make this happen. And we understand some of the leadership challenges that are associated with this. But you understand the strategic issues and the market issues. And I think that's where there's complementarity.
Yeah, it's where ambidexterity comes in is it's embellishing the micro foundations and a process for actually doing it. It's operationalizing it. No, you did right. So, yeah, but the question is, does the audience really care? Is there an audience that cares? And so, what confusion do you create if you just focus on operationalizing it and you leave out the strategy bit? I mean, are people going to make gross errors, or are they going to patch it up themselves anyway?
Well, I think the audience. I mean, I think the audience are big companies. You know, you observed earlier today that this notion of digital disruption is just getting started. Right. I think big companies. I mean. For the rest of the audience, the class, ambidexterity has gotten very big in Japan, and it's big because they've got all these big Japanese companies who have long-term perspectives, who are not under the same financial pressures that our financial markets put them under, and they feel a sense of, I think, many of them feel a sense of stewardship, and they want these companies to prosper and survive in the future. And so they're very concerned about how do they, like NEC, like AGC, like Panasonic, how do they actually leverage? So I think the audience, and I think the US audience of senior executives is also there, or will be there, as it'll only take a couple, three, when Exxon crashes and burns, or some of these other companies start to fail, I think people will get very interested. So I think we have an audience there, David.
One final question, which is China. China is as important as Europe and the United States to the global economy today. And, of course, some of their companies are all very, very new. Some of the tech companies are very, very new, and some have been around a while. And you've got, pretty stuffy old steel and cement industries, along with, TikTok and God knows what else. What insights do you have on the dynamic capabilities of Chinese firms and the culture that exists there, and to what extent is ambidexterity relevant to their business context?
So I wish I knew. I have zero insight. I mean, onto how they're thinking about this. I've been told, I don't have personal experience, I've been told that a company like Samsung is pretty good at this, but I have no insight into China. I don't know of any reason why, if they, there's no rocket science in this. I mean, I don't know if smart managers decided that this was a viable way to get to the future. I don't know of any reason that they couldn't do this, and probably do it in some ways better because they've got more government support than what many of our companies have. Government, not support, direct support, but sort of legitimation for this sort of thing.
Right, and they definitely have a sense of stewardship. They've got to keep the employee base happy, and that's all part of the political calculus.
Right.
Well, Charles, this is, it's such short notice being available. It's a great privilege to me and to all of the class here. It's really incredibly stimulating. You've been recorded, by the way, for posterity. I didn't ask for your permission, I just took it. But this will be something that's worth reviewing, and I will do so myself, actually, because I do want to see if we can't sort of sort this out. Because
we need to do this, David. I mean, the students don't need another theory. They need a framework that is proven and that can be implemented, that has no kind of magic or mystery in it. And I think we can do that. I think with your experience, your practical experience, I think we can do that.
The academic world should apologize collectively to the rest of the world for creating a lot more confusion than is necessary, because everybody likes to push their own thing and not think about really trying to integrate this for the betterment of society. So that's what you and I are going to do. And we'll try and set an example. We'll try and lead and disrupt within the academic world ourselves.
Okay, guys. So thank you all. Good luck. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Charles. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, well, what a wonderful opportunity that was. Do any of you have anything you want to say? We're almost at the break time. Maybe we'll take the break now, Ian. Are you still there? You're blotted out on my screen, but I assume you're there somewhere. Let's take our 15-minute break now and regroup. Okay, everybody.